At 62 years old, she stood in front of a mirror for the first time, not to fix her hair, not to check if she looked presentable for someone else, but just to look. And she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. That moment lasted 30 seconds, but it took 40 years to arrive. Her name is Margaret. She's not famous. She never made headlines. She never asked anyone to notice her. And for 40 years, almost nobody did. But her story belongs to millions of people watching this right now. Because Margaret wasn't born a martyr. She was made into one, slowly, quietly, one sacrifice at a time. And the cruelest part? Every single sacrifice felt like love. That's the story nobody tells until now. Margaret grew up in a home where selflessness wasn't encouraged. It was required, not through cruelty, through culture. Her mother modeled it. Her grandmother lived it. The unspoken rule was simple. A good woman puts herself last. At 14, she gave up her bedroom without being asked. A sick relative needed it. She slept on the couch for 8 months and told herself it was fine. At 19, she got accepted to a college 2 cities away. Her mother's health declined that same month. She didn't go. She stayed. She never spoke about it again. At 24, she married a kind man who had never once learned to take care of himself, because the women in his life had always done it for him. At 28, her first child arrived. And Margaret, the girl who once wanted to study literature, who once painted watercolors on Sunday mornings, quietly disappeared. Not all at once, just piece by piece, year by year. Psychologists call this self-erasure through prolonged role absorption. Research from the American Psychological Association confirms that individuals, disproportionately women, who spend years in high-demand caregiver roles begin to dissociate from personal identity. Their wants feel foreign, their needs feel selfish. Their voice goes quiet until they can no longer hear it themselves. Margaret didn't know the term, she just lived it. Her 30s were a blur of packed lunches, parent-teacher meetings, double shifts, and dinners that were always hot for everyone else and cold by the time she sat down. Her 40s brought something harder. Her husband was diagnosed with a chronic illness. Overnight, Margaret became his full-time caregiver, on top of her job, on top of raising 2 teenagers, on top of everything she was already carrying alone. 5 years. Not once did someone sit her down and ask, "How are you holding up?" Not once did she ask it of herself. Her 50s arrived with a deceptive exhale. Children left for their own lives. Her husband recovered. She thought, finally, space. But within a year, her aging father moved in. The cycle simply restarted with a different person at the center. Then, at 60, both parents gone, husband stable, children settled, and for the first time in 4 decades, silence. Complete, terrifying silence. She didn't know what to do with it. She didn't know what she liked anymore, what she wanted, what made her feel alive. Those questions had been unanswered for so long they had stopped being asked. A 2019 study published in The Gerontologist found that long-term caregivers, particularly those who begin caregiving in early adulthood, report the highest rates of identity confusion after caregiving ends, not relief. Confusion. Because when your entire sense of purpose is built around others, their absence doesn't free you. It empties you. Margaret was empty. The moment that broke her open wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday, a restaurant, ordinary. A waiter asked her, "And what would you like?" She froze. She looked at the menu. She looked at her daughter sitting across the table. And she ordered what she thought her daughter would approve of, not what she wanted. She didn't know what she wanted. She went home. She sat on the edge of her bed, and she cried for 3 hours, ugly, heaving, crying, and she couldn't explain why. Later that week, her daughter called to check on her, and she asked the question that cracked everything open. "Mom, when is the last time you did something that made you happy? Not us, not Dad, just you." Margaret opened her mouth. Nothing came out. That silence was the most honest thing she had said in 40 years. Neurologically, what Margaret experienced is documented. When a person has spent decades suppressing personal identity in favor of relational roles, the neural pathways associated with self-referential thinking, centered in the brain's medial prefrontal cortex, become significantly underactivated. The brain, quite literally, loses practice at answering the question, "What do I want?" She wasn't broken. She was conditioned. There's a difference, and that difference is where her story truly begins. At 62, Margaret made a decision that felt, to her, more terrifying than anything she had ever done. She chose herself. Not dramatically, not perfectly. One small, radical act at a time. She enrolled in a painting class, the thing 17-year-old Margaret had loved before the world taught her to love duty more. The first session, she cried, not from sadness, from recognition, like meeting someone she used to know. She booked a solo trip, 4 days, a small coastal town, no agenda. Her family thought it was unusual. She went anyway. She sat on a beach alone and felt something she hadn't felt in 40 years, the particular peace of existing without being needed. She started therapy at 62. Her therapist told her something that reorganized her entire understanding of her own life. Giving from depletion isn't love. It's survival dressed up as virtue. She began saying no, small no's at first, a neighbor's request, a committee she never wanted to join. The guilt that followed was immense. She sat with it. She didn't collapse under it. Over time, it got lighter. She started waking up 30 minutes early every morning, not to make breakfast, not to prepare for someone else's day, but just to sit in silence with a cup of tea and simply exist. Research from Stanford's Center on Longevity shows that adults who actively pursue identity reconstruction after 60 through creative pursuits, solo experiences, and therapeutic reflection report life satisfaction scores higher than their earlier decades. It is never too late. The science confirms what Margaret was slowly, stubbornly proving with her own life. A year into choosing herself, Margaret said something to her daughter that stopped them both. "I think I spent 40 years confusing love with disappearing." That sentence contains a truth that our culture rarely speaks plainly. We celebrate self-sacrifice. We romanticize it, especially in women, especially in mothers. We call it devotion. We call it strength. And sometimes it is. But there is a line, thin and dangerous, between giving generously and giving yourself away entirely. Most people who cross that line don't notice until they're standing in front of a mirror, 62 years old, not recognizing their own face. Here is what Margaret learned and what this story is really about. Choosing yourself is not the opposite of loving others. It is the foundation of it. You cannot pour from empty. You cannot show up fully for others when you have spent decades not showing up for yourself. Her relationships didn't suffer when she chose herself. They deepened because she stopped performing love from exhaustion and started offering it from a place of actual wholeness. The cultural lie is that selflessness and self-worth are opposites. They are not. The most genuinely giving people in the world are those who also know deeply who they are and what they need. Margaret knows that now. At 62, she knows it for the first time. 1 year later, same mirror, same woman. She looks at herself. This time, she doesn't search the face of a stranger. She recognizes the eyes. She knows the woman looking back. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. She smiles. Not because life is easier. Not because everything she gave was worth it or wasn't. Not because the 40 years were wasted or weren't. But because, finally, she is in her own story. Not as a supporting character, as the lead. Margaret's story was never told because we don't tell stories like hers. We tell stories about grand gestures, about people who fought for something loudly. But the quietest, hardest, most revolutionary act of her entire life was simply deciding, at 62, that she mattered. She didn't choose herself instead of loving others. She chose herself so she finally had something real to give. If you watched this and felt something shift, if some part of this story felt uncomfortably familiar, sit with that and ask yourself the question Margaret couldn't answer. When is the last time you did something just for you? You don't have to wait 40 years for the answer.